Evan Thompson had been a trucker for over 20 years. He knew every inch of the back roads, every creak of his rig, and the lonely, endless stretches of highway that seemed to roll on forever. It was a life of solitude, but it suited him just fine. The long hours behind the wheel gave him time to think, or more often than not, to simply not think and let the miles slip away under the tires. But this night was different. Evan had been driving from Dallas to Memphis, hauling a load of crates from a job site in the middle of nowhere. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and all that was left were the dark, endless stretches of highway, the flickering lights of the distant towns, and the occasional flash of deer in the road. He had the windows down, the cool night air mixing with the hum of the engine, when the radio crackled. "Breaker, 12-9, you copy, 23? Evan blinked, startled. For a second, he thought he'd imagined it. The radio was old, but it still worked fine, mostly. He hadn't heard another trucker on the channel in hours. He grabbed the mic. 23 here. Who's out there?" Static hissed back, followed by a deep voice, strained and shaky like someone on the edge of panic. "You gotta pull over. It's not safe tonight." Evan's fingers tightened on the mic, but there was no reply. He looked out at the dark road ahead, the only light coming from his headlights slicing through the blackness, revealing nothing but endless trees and the occasional sign for the next town, miles away. "Who is this?" "Come on, speak up," Evan demanded, but the line went silent. Then the voice came again, slow and deliberate. "I saw it. You won't make it." The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He'd been out on the road long enough to know when a fellow driver was messing around, but there was something about this one, something in the urgency of the voice. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles going white. "What the hell are you talking about? What did you see?" The line went silent. The only sound now was the low rumble of the diesel engine and the rhythmic swish of the tires on the asphalt. Evan looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing but dark, endless road behind him. "I'm serious. Pull over," the voice whispered, more forcefully now. "Before it's too late." Evan rolled his eyes. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe the guy had been out on the road too long, but he wasn't about to stop for something that sounded like it belonged in a bad horror movie. "I don't have time for this," he said, his voice gruff. "I've got a deadline to meet." He slammed the mic down into its holder, ignoring the voice's faint protests in the background. He wasn't about to waste time on some crazy driver, but something in the back of his mind kept nagging him. "Pull over, just pull over." Evan shook his head, trying to dismiss it. He had miles to go before he could rest. Memphis was calling, and there was no way he'd make his delivery if he stopped now. Besides, nothing bad ever happened on these back roads, just a long stretch of rural nothing. The truck hummed along, the lonely stretch of road giving him nothing to look at, except the occasional flicker of a sign for a ghost town or some abandoned gas station. The minutes stretched into hours. There was no one on the road, no cars, no trucks, just the sound of his engine and the wind in his ears. That's when he saw it, a light ahead. At first, it was just a tiny glimmer in the distance, barely visible through the trees. Evan squinted, unsure if it was a trick of his tired eyes, but it grew larger, brighter. As he got closer, he could make out the outline of a small house sitting at the edge of the road, its porch light flickering weakly. There was no other sign of life for miles. Evan's curiosity got the better of him. He slowed down, the truck rumbling to a stop in front of the house. The light flickered once more before it went out completely, leaving the place in total darkness. He considered driving past, but something told him to stop. Maybe just ask for directions, he reasoned. He hadn't seen a gas station in over 100 miles and his phone had no service. He grabbed his flashlight from the passenger seat and stepped out into the crisp night air. The house was old, its paint peeling and the front porch sagging. The windows were boarded up, except for one on the far side of the house that looked like it had been smashed in years ago. The air around it was still, as if the place had been abandoned for a long time. As he approached the front door, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A shadow, just beyond the edge of the porch. His hand tightened around the flashlight. He reached the door and knocked, his fist making a hollow thud against the wood. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. The wood groaned under the force and the door shifted slightly, as if it had been barely hanging on for years. "Hello? Anybody home?" Evan called out, his voice thick with uncertainty. The silence was heavy. No wind, no animals, nothing. Evan's stomach twisted. He took a step back, eyes scanning the dark windows, the darkness seeming to swallow everything around him. That's when he heard it, a low, guttural moan. Evan froze. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. It came again, louder this time. The sound seemed to be coming from the woods behind the house, just beyond the trees. He swung his flashlight toward the noise, but the beam revealed nothing, just trees and shadows. A cold shiver crawled up his spine. He stepped backward, hand still clutching the flashlight. The house, once so curious, now felt like a trap. He turned to the truck, about to head back, when a movement caught his eye. A figure, a man standing by the edge of the trees watching him. Evan's heart raced. The man was tall, gaunt, his skin stretched tight over bone, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were black, deep, hollow pits that seemed to soak up the light from Evan's flashlight. Evan took a step back, his mouth going dry. He didn't know what he was seeing, but it didn't look human. "Who are you?" Evan asked, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just stared. Then slowly it raised a hand. Not to wave, but to point, as if directing Evan's gaze toward the forest. Evan's blood ran cold. He turned to look into the woods, and that's when he saw them. More figures. They were emerging from the darkness between the trees, shapes twisted and wrong like human silhouettes made from shadows. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. Some were crawling on all fours, others shambled forward, their limbs twisted in ways that defied physics. Evan stepped backward, heart racing. His mind screamed at him to run, to get back to the truck and never look back, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot. One of the figures, its face grotesque and contorted, let out a horrible high-pitched scream. The others followed suit, their voices a chorus of pain and rage. The noise was deafening, like nails scraping across a chalkboard. Evan felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He stumbled backward, crashing into the porch railing. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He spun around, trying to find the truck, but the path seemed to twist and shift, the trees closing in on him, trapping him in the nightmarish scene. The figures were coming closer now, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. He ran. He didn't know how, but his legs moved, pumping through the thick air. His chest burned, but he didn't dare stop. He heard the footsteps behind him, the growls, the twisted moans that seemed to grow louder with each step. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He reached the truck, hands shaking as he fumbled for the keys. When he finally started the engine, the truck roared to life, but the figures were almost upon him. They were closing in, their twisted forms leaping from the shadows. He slammed the truck into gear and floored it. The wheels spun, and then the truck lurched forward, crashing through the trees and leaving the house and the nightmare behind him. But as the road opened up before him and the trees thinned, Evan dared to glance back. And that's when he saw it. The house. The porch light flickering again, dim and distant, as if nothing had ever happened. As if the figures, the screams, the shadows, had never been there at all. But he knew they had. Evan's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. There was no turning back now. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't be stopping anytime soon.